Hi everyone, and welcome back to designing servers for scalable internet. Today we're going to be going over part 2 of the course. Last time we talked about some of the basics of servers, what they are and how they work. And today we're actually going to be building our very own server. We're going to be writing a client and a server in Node.js and playing around with having the two send messages back and forth and see what kind of stuff we can pass around. So right here I've got open two files, a server file and a client file. And we're going to start just by going over very, very basic server and client that you could write in Node.js. So let's start with our server. We got this JavaScript file, and I'm going to slowly go over the code, uncommenting it bit by bit so we can follow along. So to start with, we import some libraries. These are very popular. Express is a very popular Node.js library that you can use for building servers. So far, we just have library imports. And the next thing we need is a port. So like we talked about last time, all servers run on a certain port. So we have to pick one. This is somewhat arbitrary. I picked 3000 for now. And then what we do is we start the server up. So on this Express library that we imported, we call a function called listen, and we give it a port. And this is us saying that the server should start listening for incoming connections, incoming requests from clients on this port. And the rest of this is essentially a function. It says, well, once you do this, call this function. And so this is a JavaScript function of one object, one input parameter, and this is the body of the function. And so all this does is when the server starts up, it prints. So in JavaScript, you print using console.log. It prints a message saying, hey, the server is ready. The server is listening on port 3000. So now we have the server listening on a certain port. Like we talked about in part 1, we have to set up our endpoints. So these are going to be different things that clients can request from us to do. So the way we do that is again using this library that we have, and we say when someone tries to send a request to /login, that's going to be our running example for now, we're going to execute this function. And so this function is a JavaScript function that takes two things and does this. And for now, the only thing it does is it puts together a response and it sends back to the client, hello from the server. So if any client tries to talk to this server at /login, it's going to get back a string that says hello from the server. And that's all our server does for now. So looking at the client now, we once again start with a library import. Request is another very popular Node.js library that you can use to play around with these things. And the first thing we have to do on the client side is figure out who we're talking to. And so these are the three parts that we talked about in part 1, the address, the port, and the endpoint. So the way we put together the URL for the server is that we say we want to talk to the server at this IP address. And now this is a special IP address that means we're not trying to talk to some server across the internet. We're actually trying to talk to ourselves. So this address is the same, our own computer is what it represents. It's sometimes called localhost. So this is us saying we're actually going to talk to a server that's running on the very same computer. The port that we need is 3000, and it's very important that these two ports line up. So I chose this arbitrarily, but the only thing that's important is that the client knows that the server is expecting incoming connections on port 3000. And lastly, we need the endpoint. Again, the client needs to know that the server is expecting it to talk to it at /login. So once again, we're running with /login as our example. And then we just concat everything together. We have HTTP, our address, a colon, the port, a slash, and then the login. And all this together puts together a full URL that we can reach the server at. Now the next thing we need is to actually send the request. So the way you do that with this request library is you say, I want to send a request. So this is a function call. and you pass it this options object. And the options object is a JavaScript object that for now has one thing. It has a field called URL, and that is the URL that you're trying to talk to. And so we are passing it this URL that we put together. So this function call is going to send a request to this URL, and when it gets back a response, it's going to execute this function. And so this is a function that takes three things, and it does this. And all it's doing for now is it's printing client got back message from the server, and then it prints the message that the server gave it. So this body object is going to come from the server. So as it stands, we have a client and a server. The server expects to get requests on port 3000 at /login and just says hello. And the client sends one request to the server, and it shows off what it got back from the server. So let's see if this works. So we're going to start up the server down here at the bottom right. We say node, and then the file name that we're trying to run. So we're going to run this server.js file. And we see that server's listening on 3000. That is this part of the code. That is the server up and ready to start receiving requests. So the server is ready, but again, like we talked about last time, it only does its job when it actually receives a request from a client. Now on the bottom left here, we're going to run the client node and then the name of the file. And so what we're expecting it to do is when we run this, it's going to make that request to the server, send it, and then in theory, it should print client got back message from the server and then hello from the server, because that's what the server is going to give it back. And that's exactly what we see. We see client got back message from the server, hello from the server. So that was our client sending a request to the server, and then the server sending a response back to the client. Now one thing to note is that the server is still running. So the server runs in theory forever, and it can keep serving requests from clients. But this client sent that request, got back the response, and now the client is done. But we can keep running the client as many times as we want, and this one instance of the server is able to handle requests one after the other. So we can do this all day, and the server should always be able to serve our client. We're going to get into having lots of clients later on in the course, but the idea is imagine all these different clients being maybe different people's weather apps on their phones, and all these clients can talk to this one server at the same time, and the server can answer all their requests all at the same time. This is kind of cool. Now we can actually talk between two different programs, and this server could be anywhere in the world. All we need to know is this information, and we can have the two talking to each other. But static messages like these are only get us so far. What we really want to do is pass along data between the client and the server. And the way we do that is like this. With the same request function call that we have here, this options object that we specify the type of request, we're going to pass in a new object, and that object is called parameters. So in this options object, we now have a new field called queries, or QS for short, and we're going to give it this object that we made. And this object is another object of two fields. It has a field called username and a field called password. And the username is set to David and password is set to pass. And the idea is that we are logging in, so to speak, to the server, and we're supplying it a username and password with our request. On the server side, when someone sends it a request to /login, we're going to print something else. We're going to say client gave me, and then this expression. So request.query is the object that the client supplies. And in order to print it, we have to convert this object into a string. So we use this function called stringify. This is just so that we can see it on the command line down here. In theory, this object should have the same structure as this object over here. So if we run this, we should see something very similar to what we had down here, except now we're going to see an extra message on the server side saying, hey, the client sent me a request on /login, and it also gave me two fields, username and password. So let's see if we can get that. So we're going to kill the server, because we changed, when we changed the code of the server, you have to start it up again. So from the top, we start up the server. The server is ready and listening. And then we run the client. and nothing forbid. So let's see, maybe we didn't save. Let's try it one more time. Save everything. Let's see, what are we doing wrong here? Alright, sorry about that. So one thing about servers that can be a little finicky, as it turns out, our problem was that this port that I chose arbitrarily was already being used by another server, and the two of them were clashing. But now we sorted all that out, so let's try this again. Just to recap, we're having the server expect some information from the client. It's going to print it out, and the client's going to supply two things, two fields, a username that's set to David and a password called pass. So let's run our server. Our server's listening on 3000, and our client's going to send that request to this object. And so what we see is that, that's a small typo, we see that the client sent a request to the server, and it got back its message, hello from the server. But now the server is printing a new line and saying, client gave me username David, password pass. And so what we're doing here is we're actually passing this object from the client to the server. And this, as it turns out, is really powerful because we can have the server and the client pass around whatever information they need. So on this login endpoint, maybe it's a username and a password. Maybe if you're trying to look at someone's profile on a social media site, you have to say whose profile you're looking at. It can be any sort of information we can pass back and forth between the client and the server. And again, because the server could be sitting anywhere in the world, this is a really powerful tool because we can build really, really complex and interesting programs that pass around information back and forth. So as a small example, let's actually try to do something with this, with these two fields. So right here we have important work being done. Let's think of something to do. But how about we check that the username and password are correct to log into our service. So let's get out the username first. So we look at the same object that we were printing up here, and in JavaScript we access fields of objects like this. And now here we're going to get out the password. And now we have these two variables that hold the given username and the given password. And we're going to do a really basic check. We're going to say, well, if this is the one user that we're allowing, so if the username is set to David and the password is set to pass, we're going to send back welcome in. But if it's anything else, we're going to say incorrect username or password. We're not going to let them in. So now, just to recap, we print what the client is giving to the server, and we do this little check where we say, well, if we get back the expected username and password, we're going to say, hey, welcome in. Otherwise, we're going to say, sorry, try again. That's the wrong password. On the client side, nothing changes. We're still going to supply David and pass, and we're going to see what message we get back from the server this time. So let's start up the server again. And let's run the client. And we see that the server prints username David, password pass, and the client sees welcome in. So the server's happy with us. But if we change this at all, if we change David to Joe, and we try to run this client, and notice we're not doing anything to the server, so the server is still running, now we get back a different message. So the server saw the username was Joe, and the client got back incorrect username and password, you can't come in. So even in this very simple example, we can see just how powerful servers can be, and how even being able to pass any data back and forth, you can basically write your own login endpoint. And in here, you can have all sorts of operations happen before you send the response back to the client. You could be checking databases. You can be making sure that the password has, an uppercase character, or lowercase character, whatever you might want to do. all of this would happen in between the start of this function and you setting back the response. So this is our first look at a basic client and server in Node.js. Next time, we're going to get a little bit more advanced. We're going to see what happens when servers might get overloaded. So we talked about how you can have lots and lots of clients sending the requests to servers, but at a certain point, the server gets overloaded and issues arise where the server can't keep up with the demand and things start to fail. So we're going to simulate such an environment. We're going to simulate a server, getting too many requests. We're going to look at one possible way that we can build the server a little differently such that it scales better and it can handle that higher demand. Thanks for listening to part 2. See you guys in part 3.